So, dear colleagues, friends, welcome to this special session on financing carbon neutrality in developed and developing countries, carbon pricing and beyond. This is a session co-hosted by the European University Institute, EUI, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, MCC, the Mercator Center for the Global Commons in Berlin, and ICAP. And we will be addressing one of the key challenges of the whole climate transition and one of the very strategic and complex, challenging topics for COP27. We know that the global emissions continue rising at roughly 1% per year in a situation where they need to decline by 5 to 7% per year. This is what makes the urgency, because the global carbon budget, to have any chance of holding 1.5, the limit beyond which we are likely to trigger a number of irreversible large tipping points and having even more loss and damage in the invoices from the global south to the global north, is not being fulfilled. We have only 10% of the global emissions have peaked in the world. That's only 35 countries of the world's 200 countries. So we need massive efforts of redirecting the financial logic in societies. Actually, in the 10 new insights in climate science that we published yesterday, one of the 10 insights in science is that we won't be able to deliver on the Paris Agreement unless we get major reforms in the financial system, because even the green financing is operating within conventional structures that do not factor in the real costs of climate damage and do not provide the benefits of finance that provides better health and better outcomes for people and ecosystems. We have emission trading schemes in the world. I mean, that's one of the pieces that we'll be coming back to and one of the positives to discuss. But it's still not adding up to significant changes. We have something like 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by one or another type of carbon pricing. It's increasing, but very slowly over the past decade. Tax measures, market measures. But when you look at it, despite the fact that the carbon pricing has record high levels in the European Union, even touching 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, which is roughly half of what the social cost of carbon science shows is the real cost currently of carbon, it's still only covering 4% of the emissions have any kind of price, and most prices are much too low. It does generate quite significant revenue, though, in the order of 84 billion US dollars per year. That's quite significant. It's almost more than the Green Climate Fund has been able to generate so far. So with transparent governance, you can, of course, redirect financial incomes in the public sector into climate action if dealt with in a responsible way. So as you see, we have a very, very complex, challenging, urgent, but also very promising landscape to cover in this session. And it's therefore with great delight and looking forward to that I hand over the panel and the moderation of the panel to my fellow host of the session, Delbeke of the European University Institute, with whom we've been organizing this session together between PIC and EUI. So over to you, Jos, to get us through the expert inputs into this session. After these two sessions, we'll have an open Q&A and a discussion with across the entire panel. Over to you, Jos.
Thank you very much, Johan, and welcome to all of you. As you rightly indicated, the challenge is huge. The promises have been made and we are not there yet. And one of the questions is, are carbon markets and carbon pricing systems going to help us out? In some constituencies, as you indicated, the prices are high, at least high according to historical standards, but not as high as they should be. So we have a distinguished panel here with us. Martin Hessian would join us and could join us, but he is involved in the Article 6 negotiations. So he said that his presence was not 100% reassured, but there is hope. You know, on Article 6, there is perhaps little progress, but always there is a break here or there coming up. Then we have Simone Borghesi, my colleague at the European University Institute and of the University of Siena. And Simone has been doing great work on the issue of carbon markets and carbon finance. And Simone is going to be followed by Stefano de Clara, who is the Secretary General of the International Carbon Action Partnership. Online, we have Silvie Kreibiehl, who was the coordinating lead author of the 6th assessment report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change when it comes to Working Group 3 Investment and Finance. So Sylvie, you have you will be holding the pen, and we are very eager to have your views. And then finally in the panel we have Dora Benedek on my right, who is Chief of the Fiscal Affairs Department in the International Monetary Fund. So without much further ado, I would like to pass over the floor to Stefano, who is going to give us an overview of where we are with carbon pricing in the world. Johan was already indicating, that carbon pricing constituencies are increasing, but we are not there yet. Stefano, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jos and Jonas, for the great introduction. So, as just mentioned, we wanted to start this discussion today with a bit of an overview of where we actually are with the implementation of carbon pricing, and more specifically, we'll look at carbon markets in the form of emission trading systems around the world. The way we will do this is that I will be providing a general overview of where we are with implementation of ETS worldwide, and then I'll let Simone dig a bit deeper into some of the aspects, especially related to how funds can be reused and rededicated to other purposes. Just a quick word about ICAP, in case you're not familiar with the organization, and I'm hoping you can see the slides on screen. If we can put up the slides on the screen, please, thank you. But in a nutshell, and while we get the slides up, ICAP is a partnership between 40 different governments around the world that work on the implementation of emission trading systems as a way to put a price on CO2 emissions. We have member jurisdictions from Europe, from North America, from Latin America, and from the Asia-Pacific region. Just to give you a quick overview of some of the key trends and considerations related to ETS around the world. If we look at where we are now with implementation of emission trading systems and what happened in this space over the last few months, we see that emissions trading is increasingly becoming a key policy tool to implement NDC commitments, and it's becoming a key policy tool to get economies to net zero emissions by 2050. 2021 and 2022 have been years of consolidation for many systems around the world. We will dig deeper into this in a second, but most of the existing systems have gone through review and reform processes over the last few months and are still going through those processes to make sure that they're well equipped to perform over the next decade. And also an overall increase in ambition and an overall level of stringency in these systems has also resulted in record carbon prices and revenues in many different systems across the world. On the map here, you can see where we are at the moment in terms of ETS implementation around the world. We do have 25 emission trading systems in operation already as of today, and those are the ones in blue on the map, and many more are in development and or under consideration in basically almost every continent. It's also worth noting that these emission trading systems are being developed and implemented at different levels of governance, all the way from international systems, such as the EU ETS, that brings together all of the European member states, plus 3 non-European countries, all the way to the national level, with many systems implemented at the country level, all the way down to systems that operate at the subnational level, so either in provinces and states, and this is the case in the US and Canada, for example, or in China, all the way down to systems that operate at the city level. So, for example, there is a city-level emission trading system in Tokyo and in Saitama in Japan. We didn't get to where we are now overnight, but that has been a process that has been underway for almost 2 decades now. The first system came online all the way back in 2005, and that was the European emission trading system, which JOS launched in 2005. New systems and more systems came online since then, almost every year, and over time they piled up to where we are today. So at the moment, emission trading systems cover roughly 17% of the overall global emissions. If on top of that you stack up also carbon taxes, you get roughly around 22-23% of the global emissions, as Jonas was saying. Just in terms of stats, it's also worth noting that after the Chinese ETS came online, now 1/3 of the global population lives under an ETS in force, and jurisdictions making up for 55% of the global GDP are using emission trading system as a way to reduce emissions. These systems are really different in nature and in design. They can cover different sectors, they can be shaped in different ways. We will not go into this too much in detail, but I just wanted to mention that systems can cover different parts of the economy. You do have systems that only cover one sector, so for example only cover the power sector. Most systems tend to cover at least power and industry, but other sectors have also expanded to cover more sectors. So you find emission trading systems that cover transport and buildings, for example. You do have emission trading systems that cover the aviation sector. Some systems cover waste, and systems also cover the forestry sector. Because of this, also the overall percentage of domestic emissions covered by emission trading systems can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdictions, all the way from some systems that only cover a small portion of the overall emissions. On the slide you can see RGGI, for example, that covers 11% of the overall emissions, all the way to systems that cover the vast majority of the overall emissions. So, for example, you have California and Quebec that cover roughly 70 or 80% of the overall emission of that economy. As it was mentioned in the introduction, we also saw interesting developments on the price front. Being a market-based tool, prices tend to vary over time, and they also respond to internal and external drivers. As a result of this, and especially as a result of reforms in different jurisdictions that have raised ambition over time, ever since 2018 or 2019, prices have been steadily rising over time, and especially in the EU and in the UK, they have reached record levels over the last 12 months or so, where they got really close to 100 euros a ton. In the upper half of the slide, you can also see how prices performed over the last few months and since the beginning of the year. As we all know, 2022 was a year characterized by major shocks and changes in the overall energy system. We are currently in an energy crisis in most of the world, but still over the last 6 months or so, emission trading systems and prices in these emission trading systems have proven to be overall resilient to the external shocks, and we didn't have massive price fluctuations or massive negative responses in the existing emission trading systems. As a result of higher price levels recently, and also as a result of more and more systems moving towards auctioning as a method of allocating allowances, these systems also started to raise a significant amount of auctioning revenues. So they started to channel a lot of money back from covered entities into the regulators' coffers. Ever since auctioning started in the world of emission trading systems, so from 2008, overall emission trading systems have raised a grand total of 160 billion of US dollars in auctioning revenues. But it's also worth noting that 1/3 of the total amount, so around 50 billion, was raised in 2021 alone, and that is because of more auctioning in more systems and because of higher carbon prices. So out of the total over the last 15 years or so, 1/3 was raised last year alone. And as we will run the numbers at the end of this year, we're expecting to see a matching figure, if not even higher, for 2022. This is important because revenues are an important instrument at the disposal of ETS regulators to do either further climate action or to address specific concerns, and Simone will go into that in a second. Before I come to a close, I just wanted to make a couple of quick considerations in relation to emission trading systems worldwide, and especially in relation with the ongoing energy crisis. As a response to the energy crisis, governments around the world have strongly reaffirmed the central role of emission trading systems in the decarbonization. So instead of walking away from carbon pricing and climate action, they have reaffirmed their commitment to it. As I've just shown, most systems have proven to be relatively resilient to external shocks, and we didn't see any dramatic effect on existing systems as a result of the ongoing energy crisis. And even though, because of the energy crisis and because of other drivers as well, we are expecting to see a lot of challenges ahead, and we can reflect on that a bit later in the discussion. Emission trading systems do have a role to play going forward, and they will play a central role in the decarbonization efforts and in paving the way to get to net zero emissions around 2050. For more information, I'll defer to the ICAP website. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll give the floor to Simone to dive a bit deeper into these topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for this very clear overview. And I just wanted to echo what you were saying, is that carbon markets have been raising more money and have been quite resilient for the energy crisis that is currently happening. And it's not a theoretical notion. When we were in the EU negotiating in 2016-17, the Innovation Fund, we thought we were talking about a maximum envelope of 5 billion. Today, the 5 billion is now 50 to 70 billion, depending on the price development we have seen in the past or we may see in the future. So a tenfold increase of the budget, creates also a headache for officials here and there, because they have now to spend the money. And that's good news, but also sees and shows the strains that can be on a system. Simone has been, Simone Borghesi, my colleague in Florence, have been studying on behalf of the European Commission carbon markets extensively. So Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jos. And thank you, Stefano, because your presentation was a perfect introduction to mine, I think. The subtitle of this event is Carbon Pricing and Beyond. So I will try to start from carbon pricing, but go beyond and draw the attention on some aspects, especially distributional aspects and social acceptability of carbon pricing, which I believe are crucial for the future of the climate policies, and I would say for their own survival in a way. So I will first give a very quick look at carbon markets and carbon prices around the world, but from a different perspective, the perspective of the Life Digital project, which I have directed in the last few years. Then move on to discuss the distribution effects and social acceptability of carbon pricing, asking two questions: whether the emission trading system revenues can be considered as an endogenous solution to address distributional problems, and whether they should be earmarked, and showing an international comparison in the approaches across countries. And finally conclude with some final remarks. As Stefano was saying, carbon markets have spread around the world, and quite rapidly so. But in the absence of a global carbon market, extending carbon markets can be a way to proceed towards a global carbon price. So this motivated the project named Life Digit. Digit stands for Deepening International Cooperation on Emissions Trading, which aims at comparing the different ETSs, exchanging information, and possibly link them in the future. The jurisdictions that were part of this project, that were actively involved, are those that you see on the map, namely California and Quebec, Europe, Switzerland, China, and New Zealand, which are the main ETSs worldwide at the moment. And as it was said by Stefano, their prices were all on the rise, especially since the beginning of 2018. In this diagram, you see Europe in blue, Switzerland in red. Swiss ETS converged in prices to the European one since 2020, when they joined their markets. In green, you have New Zealand. In blue, California, Quebec, which were linked in 2014. And down there, you have China, which it's in infancy, basically. And I also have to say that up there was not in our group of jurisdictions, but we also have UK, which delinked from the European one, but is basically at the same level as the European one. And you see that despite the ups and downs provoked by COVID first and the war afterwards, all prices are on the rise, but also with large differences. The European, Swiss, UK price is about twice as much as the New Zealand, 3 times higher than California and Quebec, and a lot more than the Chinese price. Not only carbon prices increased, but also gas and oil prices, as you know, increased. And this diagram shows how much in the last year or so. It starts from the beginning of April 2021 and goes up to now. In red, you have oil. In green, you have gas. And in gray, you have carbon. So starting from April 1, as setting equals to 100, the initial value, we have that oil and carbon markets doubled their price in little more than 1 year, and gas increased by 2.5, actually picking up at 4.5 during this range of time. This increase in prices, in my view, goes in the right direction if we want to internalize externalities and reduce the use of fossil fuels. But obviously, it also has important distribution effects. And these distribution effects are likely to be regressive. Why? Because poor households spend larger income share on energy and carbon-intensive goods, face higher financial constraints to adopt low-carbon and energy-saving technologies, and are more likely to suffer from the job losses that occur in the energy and in carbon-intensive sectors. So this raises an issue of social acceptability of higher prices, and also motivates the research line that we are somehow developing. Basically, we wonder whether there is a maximum level price that people are willing to accept. How high is that? and how can we increase that acceptability. What we know from the literature is that the acceptability of the policy depends pretty much on the size and on the use of the revenues. So this brings to the two questions. What's the size of carbon pricing revenues, and what has been the use of this revenue so far? As to the first question, I think this diagram provides a clear answer. Carbon revenues have been rising together with the rise in prices up to 84 billion in 2021, starting from 20 billion in 2006. And this 24 billion includes 46 billions from ETSs. It's this remarkable that for the first time in 21, ETS revenues overcame carbon tax revenues in a ratio that is now 2/3 to 1/3, more or less. And the pie diagram on the right shows you in red the countries where ETS revenues were raised and how much, as compared to those in blue, which are the carbon tax revenues. If we focus more specifically on Europe and we disentangle the question on size and use in Europe, well, it's interesting to notice that some studies like Fewest and Pisani-Ferry in 2020 estimate that the EU ETS revenues can raise between 800 and 1,500 billion euros by 2050. If we compare this number with the European coronavirus aid package, which was 750 billions, we realized that we can get up to twice that much. So we are sitting on the gold mine, in my view, because in the long run, we can repay the recovery plan through the ETS, European ETS in this case. On top of that, if the ETS will be extended to road and transport, the so-called ETS2, then we can expect another 144 billion euros by the Social Climate Fund to address distributional aspects between 25 and 32. And this can also be used for the modernization fund. It is expected between 20 and 25 billion euros for the modernization fund in this decade. So there are money. That's the size of money. How have they been used? Well, according to a European Commission study, 72% of this money have been used for climate and energy goals, which is fine. Actually, the Commission would like to bring it to 100%. But different countries use different approaches. Some earmark this money, so devote specifically to this. Others use them for the general budget. And this diagram should help you visualize the different approaches. The countries in green, so Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and others, earmark these revenues. Those in purple, Sweden, Finland, Poland, Ireland, they did not earmark. They used just for the general budget. And some others, Spain, France, Italy, those in yellow, adopted a mixed approach. It is obvious that every country is sovereign on how to use its own revenues. However, if I may provoke a bit, I think we should use a common approach, a common share of ETS revenues devoted to social compensation, or at least a minimum share devoted to social compensations, particularly in this period. Why? Well, Europe has a common climate policy. It has a common carbon market. It has a common monetary policy, at least the European Monetary Union. What is lacking is the fiscal policy. And we know how difficult it is, but also the kind of asymmetries that this creates. So why not starting from a common share in the ETS revenues being used, like a first step in the direction of a common, let's say, climate fiscal policy? I would have provoked Martin, but unfortunately Martin is not here. I will tell him separately. I don't want to use too much of your time, so let me come to my conclusions. I think carbon pricing is key in reducing emissions. It's a key signal that we should use. However, it raises obvious doubts on whether it may lead to a just transition. But my answer to this question, whether it can be just, is theoretically yes. I think that the ETS revenues can address distributional problems. As prices increase, the revenues increase, and so we have the money to address distributional problems. So a kind of endogenous solution. However, as one of my professors used to say, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they aren't. So in practice, what should we do? I think we should earmark the revenues to reduce the perceived gap between the costs and the benefits of the policies. To improve the perceived gap, we should improve on the perception. So we should also improve the communication strategy. And in this regard, we should probably anticipate some of the spending. For instance, the one of the Social Climate Fund, it is to be spent now. And on this, I agree with the publication by Ian Cornell and Delbeke and others that they were suggesting this solution. Finally, let me conclude with something that is closely related to the ETS revenues, the CBAM revenues. We know CBAM is a very hot topic, but let me say that if CBAM revenues were used for developing countries, this would be a large improvement. If CBAM is perceived as a protectionist measure, it will have detrimental effects in terms of trade wars and retaliation, let's say, to say the least. But if we use these revenues for technological transfer or climate finance to developing countries, then we can have them on board. And I think recycling the revenues of the ETS and of the CBAM would gain the social acceptability of climate policies that we need, both within jurisdictions with the ETS revenues and across jurisdiction with the CBAM revenues. So a common approach might do the trick, so to speak. So with this and with a few references, I leave you, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Simone, for making a strong plea for using part of the revenues from the ETS for compensating social strain. I think with the high carbon prices and the high energy prices, that has really become a hot issue being debated not only in Europe but elsewhere. But also making your plea for using the CBAM revenues in a way that helps developing countries. And so let's turn to that dimension, carbon pricing, climate finance perspectives in developing countries. And I would like to invite Silvie Kreibiehl, who has been doing extremely useful work in the context of the IPCC and in particular on investment and finance. So Silvie, may I pass the floor to you?
Yeah, many thanks. I hope the connection is good and you can hear me well. Yeah, I see you nodding. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for having me. I would like to take one step back and discuss some of the quantitative aspects on financing needs in developing countries. I think this is very important to be understood when it comes to the discussion of solutions. You referred to the analysis we have presented in the IPCC report. Many thanks for that. This analysis focuses very much on downstream mitigation finance. So please keep in mind that this is only one component of overall financing need. It does not consider costs, it does not consider soft costs, and ignores this cascade of financing needs. And let me allow a couple of sentences why these components are so important. First, on capacity building. We need way more international grant financing and national budget allocations for soft costs like the creation of regulatory environments, including sectoral reforms. This is really a prerequisite for the supply of commercial financing and for in the deployment of technologies. But of course, those needs are really difficult to aggregate. UNFCCC did a quite good report on the needs, which was just published a couple of days after the IPCC literature cut-off date. So this is not included. And it's also a little bit difficult to standardize assumptions on that one. That's the reason why we have not included those needs. Nevertheless, they might represent only a very small share of overall investment needs, but gaps and a current limited supply for that will actually hinder the deployment of large-scale financing in later years. So it's very important to stress that. On costs, IPCC presents costs per technologies in very much detail. Excuse me. It is difficult, however, to allocate costs and to do this cost analysis on a regional basis, and that's the reason why we focus on investments in downstream in mitigation technology deployment. It's only one indicator. It is also pretty difficult to discuss solutions and how we can close gaps without considering the broader context, in particular adaptation, loss and damage, general infrastructure needs. In particular, the latter investments are at least partially necessary to facilitate mitigation investments, although they are not included in our analysis. So we have analyzed the gaps and the investment requirements for the current decade, so 2020 to 2030. And these average investment requirements for 2020 to 2030 in scenarios that limit global warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees are a factor of 3 to 6 greater than the current levels, so the flows of the most recent years. Total mitigation investments would have to increase across all sectors and across all regions. We have modeled, or we have aggregated investment needs for deployment of mitigation technology of approximately $2.4 to $4.8 trillion a year. This is quite a significant increase compared to the flows of the previous years, 3 to 6. Since 2013 and 14, climate finance flows have increased by only 60%. So it's quite a significant increase. Nevertheless, I mean, it's a relatively small increase against the background of capital markets, which are really deep enough to provide such funding. In particular, also keeping in mind the level of misaligned flows. So very important, I think, for today is that the analysis also provides a regional breakdown of needs. IPCC uses a regional breakdown in first set and then aggregate 3 of the 10 regions to developed countries and the remaining 7 to developing countries. So there might be differences in this categorization by various stakeholders, but the trend, I think, is very consistent. And it says that the widest gap between needed funding and available funding and the current funding is in developing countries. There, the funding requirements amount to 4 to 9% of GDP. This is approximately a factor 4 to 7 over current climate finance flows, and this compares to a factor 3 to 5 in developed countries, or 2 to 4% of GDP in developed countries. So these differences are quite significant, and again, general infrastructure investment needs, adaptation, loss and damage are not included in those numbers. Now, one caveat when it comes to this regional breakdown. In these model pathways, regional investments are projected to occur when and where they are most efficient to limit global warming. So this model quantification helped to identify these high priority areas for cost-effective investments, but they do not provide any indication on who should finance those regional investments. That's important. It does not move the responsibility to developing countries. So now coming back to this difference between developed and developing countries, 4 to 9% of GDP in developing countries, not by 2030, but on average 2020 to 2030. The barriers preventing finance to be deployed exist within and outside the financial sector, in the international system, but also in those countries. approximately 80% of climate finance is originated and stays within borders, even more for private sector investments. And this really illustrates well the extraordinary challenge for developing countries to overcome the relative disadvantage in attracting investments driven by regional mismatch of capital and funding needs, home bias considerations, existing macro challenges, country indebtedness levels, economic vulnerability, and so on. One aspect is in particular also institutional capacity. There are really multiple barriers to overcome, but the analysis stresses the importance of substantially increased cross-border flows and action to unlock those. We know, and there is good research on the positive correlation between institutional capacity and climate finance inflows. And this underpins the importance of ambitious local action to strengthen confidence in regulatory environments and of substantially increased international support to do so, which tends to focus on concrete investments with a very tangible emission reduction outcome. And let me add one perspective in particular coming from the EU, where the discussion focuses very much on the taxonomy right now. I think for investors, for commercial investors in the global north, it is very, very crucial to understand their role, not only in financing the transformation in the global north, but also in developing and emerging countries. They need to overcome home biases. They need to invest in processes and technologies to expand their investment universe regionally, which is a big challenge for them. And this, although the regulation in the global north is still pretty blind on this aspect. And I'm very sure that my fellow speakers will find some aspects they will dig deeper on now. And I hope that we will then also have a good Q&A and discussion session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silvie, not only to point at the gap, but at indicating that the gap is much more important for developing and emerging economies compared to the heated debates that are present in all member states, but also in the global north. And you raise a few questions related to what is exactly green, the taxonomy, etc. So shifting that question perhaps to Dora, Benedek, who is Division Chief for the Climate Policy Division at the Fiscal Affairs Department in the IMF. So Dora, you have been following this from the first row, by way of speaking. You have the floor. Eager to have your comments.
Thank you very much. And yeah, let me use this opportunity to, first of all, thank you for having me as part of this panel. And I would like to talk a little bit about the carbon pricing proposal that we usually recommend at the IMF and put it in the context of the climate finance perspective, including for the developing countries. So you are all here, so you all know that it is really vital that we take action to limit temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which actually requires cutting emissions by 25 to 50% by 2030 compared to the 2019 level. But actually, the climate policies that we currently have in place across the globe in different countries will only reach an 11% cut. So there's a huge gap between what we would need to see to be able to stay on track to net zero and what we currently have committed by the individual countries. And this is the ambitions that are put on paper, but the implementation of these ambitions is lagging further behind. So the gap between where we need to be to keep the temperature rise in check and what we have in terms of implementation so far is really big. So that means that we really need urgent action, and we need action that is meaningful and makes a big difference. So we think at the IMF that the ideal policy mix would be built around the carbon pricing. That should really be the core of the policies going forward, including elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, because that's a really important policy measure in many of the countries. But alternative measures could also support the carbon pricing with equivalent outcomes. So measures that support the same outcomes are really important to take into account. So the IMF, we have been an advocate and really champions of carbon pricing, but we haven't really seen the traction in the countries that carbon pricing would be getting. So maybe it's good to remind a little bit why we think carbon pricing is the most efficient way to make progress in keeping climate change in check. So let me mention 3 really important features why we think carbon pricing is the most efficient instrument in this fight. So first of all, it is based on market prices. It is based on market forces that really help reach the most efficient abatement opportunities. So carbon pricing operates both ways, both by reducing demand for the most polluting activities, the most efficient emission-intensive activities, but it also makes the alternative more attractive. So it encourages all the economic actors to move towards the cleaner production processes. So it's really important that good pricing mechanism really helps you to provide incentives on both sides. At the same time, it provides a really critical signal for investment. So it provides a really strong incentive for investment to move towards cleaner technologies, especially if we have a really consistent and robust and predictable future path of carbon pricing. So this predictability and credible path is something that's really important to take into account when designing individual country policies. And the third aspect is carbon pricing produces revenues. It raises revenues for country authorities, which is a really important feature, especially at this juncture where many countries are under fiscal pressures and actually have their fiscal constraints faced by their budget. So this is at a time where countries need to mobilize more revenues towards cleaner technologies to compensate vulnerable households for the impact of the shocks, for the impact of carbon pricing. So this is a time where additional revenues that are raised in an efficient way are really important. And when we talk about additional revenues, then you can also think about how those revenues can be spent. So if a government has additional domestic revenues, they can think about reducing distortionary taxes, let's say reducing labor taxes or reduces other taxes in the system. But they can also think about using these additional revenues to finance green public infrastructure or any other investment related to the green transition. So as I mentioned, we don't really see the traction that we hope to see in terms of carbon pricing. Carbon taxes or emission trading systems, we heard from the colleagues, so they are currently operating in somewhere between 45 to 50 jurisdictions. And the list continues to grow. So I think there is some popularity of carbon pricing measures. At the same time, pricing itself seems to be facing some political headwinds. So at the global level, our estimate at the IMF is that a carbon price of around $75 per ton would be needed by 2030 to get the emission on track that is consistent with the 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So $75 would be needed by 2030. However, what we see right now is that these carbon pricing systems that we have in place, they on average impose around $6 per ton. So there is a really big difference of the level that we would need to achieve to stay on track to net zero and what we currently have in the jurisdictions. So, of course, some people argue that this is not the right time to introduce carbon pricing. We have really elevated energy prices that is already causing a lot of suffering and hardship for the most vulnerable households. Businesses are suffering, so this is just not the time to introduce carbon pricing. However, carbon pricing doesn't have to result in an immediate increase in energy prices. So this is something that can be introduced gradually, starting from a lower level, and reaching higher levels over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. I think it's also important to keep in mind that energy prices are really high right now, but I think the expectation is that energy prices will start coming down. So I think it's really important that we are ready, and when energy prices start coming down, the crisis starts to recede, then that is a good time to start introducing and raising carbon pricing. Another concern that I think we already heard some references to is that countries are really reluctant to move ahead unilaterally with carbon pricing. for really good reasons. They are concerned about their competitiveness. They don't want to introduce pricing that would be higher than their peers, that would be higher than the global average. So we think for this reason, global coordination is really essential to be able to make progress. Global coordination on carbon pricing is the way to unlock progress on the carbon pricing. So our proposal at the IMF is what we call an international carbon price floor. And let me just explain briefly what are the key elements that we have there. Because coordination is important, we need to understand what is blocking it. And I think recognizing that having a small number of countries around the table is much simpler than having everyone, that really leads us to the conclusion that it might be a good idea to focus on a small number of economies as a start, and that will really ease the negotiations at the beginning. But for example, if you think about a small number of economies, they can still make a significant contribution. So the US, India, China, and the European Union, it's 4 economic areas, but these 4 jurisdictions would actually make up 2/3 of the global emission by 2030. So having a small number of countries would allow you to make a really big impact. It's also important to be pragmatic and recognize that countries are coming from really different starting points. So that leads us to the recommendation that we should accommodate lower carbon pricing in developing countries, and we should also consider alternative mitigation policies in countries that are not ready yet to introduce carbon pricing. So we need to make sure that we're inclusive in the sense that the equivalence is considered when we talk about different measures. And then the third is that carbon pricing is key to mitigation. That is really at the core of our recommendation, but it needs to be part of a broader package and a broader set of policies to be able to reduce emission. So these policy packages that countries can choose, they can take different forms. It can be carbon taxes, it can be emission trading systems, it can be fee-based or regulations. I mentioned that reductions in fossil fuel subsidies is really the most important measure that several countries will need to keep in mind. But these packages can also include components like green public investment or increased renewable energy subsidies. So the bottom line, as I mentioned, is that we should be ready to take action as we start seeing energy prices coming down, and this is the time to start preparing for that action. So carbon pricing, in our view, is really at the core of the action going forward. It is really important, but we also have to recognize that that is not going to be sufficient in itself. We need other measures too, especially in case of developing countries. The clean energy transition requires a large-scale investment, and that is not going to be possible without private sector involvement. We will need to see the private sector financing some of these investments. Carbon pricing has a key role to play by creating the right incentives for these new investments, but it needs to be supported by other reinforcing measures to be able to accelerate private financing. And these are the usual suspects. We need to see business climate being improved. We need better institutions in some cases. So strengthening institutions is always one of the most important ingredients to unlock private financing. We might need sectoral policies in some of these cases. So there could be really different components of packages depending on country circumstances. Governments should also consider spending or investing in research and development, in clean technologies that can also help catalyze private investment. And I mentioned previously that carbon pricing, one of the key features is that it raises revenues. So that's also a really important feature, that some of these additional revenues can actually be used to finance these alternative policies. But even with the right policies in place, I think it's important to recognize that some of the emerging and developing countries are facing additional constraints. They have higher risks that the investors consider, and they have less available financing, even coming from the private sector. And I think this is where the role of the multilateral development banks can become really important. These are institutions that can step in with innovative financial solutions, that can facilitate risk sharing, or that can attract private investors that would otherwise not provide the financing. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that the international community has a really large role to play. And so finally, just to mention one specific example that we're doing at the IMF. So we have now operationalized the so-called Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is a long-term instrument that supports economic transformation, including with respect to climate challenges. This RST is available to low-income countries, vulnerable middle-income countries, and for small states. And so far, we have available about $40 billion funding. We have already reached staff-level agreement with 4 countries, and there are many more interested in lining up for this kind of support. And a really important feature of this RST, this new facility that the IMF offers, is that it supports countries in designing reforms that reduce the barriers for private funding. So we really want to use this facility to unlock additional private financing and help authorities with this breaking down of barriers. We do that by promoting good climate policies, but we also focus a lot of our attention on institution building and structural reforms that help improving the business climate and therefore leverage private investment. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dora, for 2 elements, many elements, but 2 elements that I picked up. That is that you are advocating a $75 per ton of CO2 kind of carbon price by 2030, but you add to that, that implementation can start when the energy prices start going down. I think that's a very good element in having a long-term objective and having also in the medium-term reality check, that is, I think, what other panelists were breaking on, that there is a social impact in the high energy prices, perhaps more than high carbon prices are part of the debate in so many countries today. Thank you very much for all your contributions to Simone, to Stefano, to Silvie, and to Dora. I'm opening the floor for questions by each of you as well, having heard each other's contributions. Also, comments and thoughts by Johan may be very much welcome. And I open the floor to the room, and I see the hand going up here, and I take 2-3 questions in a row, and then we bring them back to the panelists. So can you pass over the microphone to this gentleman?
2?
Yeah, the gentleman here, you over there, and the lady over there. So we take them 3 in a row. Go ahead, sir.
Alistair Thompson from Scoop Media. I'm a journalist. The question relates to Global Gateway and the announcement by the American government of a significant package of investment for Africa. I think it's 200 million from Africa and 300 million from 200 billion from the US and 300 billion in Gateway from Europe, which the European funding seems to be MDB funding as far as I can tell, although clarification on that would be helpful. But what sort of impact would that could those investments have, does the panel think, in terms of speeding this up? And secondly, has any movement been seen on either of them? Because when I asked the EU negotiator about them, he seemed to be almost unaware of Global Gateway. And clearly in Africa, 150 billion, which has been essentially of investment, which has been announced for Africa, is a significant amount of money. But I mean, nothing is flowing yet that I know of.
Thank you very much. Can you give the microphone to the gentleman there, please? So I note, and I'm turning to the panelists, the Global Gateway, and the related questions, how and will the money be spent? You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Colin Nolden from the University of Oxford. What role could Article 6 play in integrating these carbon markets and eventually creating a more unified price of carbon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On Article 6, and the lady over there. Yeah.
As the woman, the panelist from the IMF was speaking, I was thinking back to a speech that the former managing director of the IMF, Michel Kamandousis, made in 1997, 25 years ago. He spoke out against the unproductive nature of military spending, and I was just thinking that the 30 member states of NATO, since the Paris Agreement, have increased their military spending annually, collectively, by $200 billion. So the 30 NATO countries are spending $1.2 trillion on their militaries, and it's going up because of the 2% target. I am wondering if the possibility of reducing military spending for climate financing, because it's so unproductive, fighter jets, warships, wars, military training, we don't need these things. We need investment in the climate catastrophe. Developing countries need this investment. So I'm wondering if you're looking at this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question about military expenditure is added to the list. Who would like to start? Johan, you start.
Yeah, thanks. I will pass on very quickly to my fellow panelists here because I don't have the expertise on either these global gateway issue. And I think on the military spending, you have a very good point. I mean, this is a valid point right across the whole transformation, that we know that the world economy is powered by energy. There's a straight line between energy consumption and global GDP, but we're not factoring in the damage it's causing, but we're using that energy to spend in many sectors that are high consuming of our capital, and military spending is one of them. And the geopolitical instability we have in the world today is a double-edged sword, which is both exponentially rising energy prices, fertilizer prices, thereby food prices, but at the same time causing the negative impacts downstream due to the very operations of conflict and war. As far as I know, we don't have any discussions at these negotiations on making that connection, but I would very strongly welcome that. I think Article 6 is definitely something that should be connected with the CBAM discussions. I think CBAM is a hot political issue, as pointed out by Simone, but I think it's also a necessity. Because when we have differentiated carbon prices rising, with very varying levels, as Simone pointed out, it's absolutely necessary to have any kind of even competitiveness on the markets, to have some form of trade-based carbon evening, and the Article 6 could potentially be used for that. And I'm interested to hear what my fellow panelists think on this.
Okay, thank you, Johan. Dora?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So let me try to address some of them. So first, maybe on the need and impact of investment. So the first point I'd like to make is that I think we need clarity on the numbers, and we need clarity on the definitions and on the concepts. So I think there are a lot of numbers going around, people having their own estimations. But I think it's important to keep in mind that recognizing that the investment needs will be tremendous, they will be really large. I think a lot of the estimations are relying on gross numbers, whereas in reality, a lot of the investment would happen maybe in another form, but they would happen in clean energy. So I think the net numbers that we're thinking about are probably much smaller than these several trillions that we are hearing. I also tried to explain in my talk that I think, domestic revenue mobilization, public revenues, resources will be a really important source of financing. Similarly, assistance or financing coming from more developed countries is also going to be a really important source of financing. At the same time, I think it's really important to recognize that without the private sector, we will not be able to find the source of all these investments. So I think we should think about how to mobilize private funding and private investment, including for the emerging countries and lower income countries. How can we have these countries unlock some of the private investment that would be available out there? Maybe on the military spending, I don't want to comment on the military spending as such. But again, maybe putting climate in this broader context of the composition of spending. I think for many of the emerging and low-income countries, we know that they are already faced with a really huge spending need related to their sustainable development. So, you know, there is a lot of discussion about SDGs, and we know that they already have a huge financing need related to that. Now, again, I think it's important to understand the context and, you know, how different aspects of spending can be interrelated. So climate and development is really important that we consider them together. Maybe, you know, if you do that, then the magnitude that is needed will be, again, come to a different context. Maybe you want me to hand over. Thank you.
Thank you. We will have more time. So I would like to ask Silvie to come in on one or the three questions in particular on the global gateway. And I saw you nodding on several things that were said. Silvie, may I pass the floor to you?
Yeah, although there is not so much I can add on the global gateway, I am not aware of the details and which kind of funding is made available. I think what I mentioned before is it's important that we do not only provide funding for concrete investments, but we also provide in particular public funding for the regulatory environment to cover costs and to finance the overall and the preparatory part of this transformation, and then also ask the private sector to come in. We see quite, in particular for Africa, quite high level of commitments with limited levels of deployments. This in particular refers also to investments in energy access, and we need to make sure that we target the primary gap, and often the primary financing gap is the one for capacity building, for the creation of regulatory frameworks, and this requires simply, in most cases, some grant financing and not investments.
Thank you. I think that's a very important comment related to the build-up of the governance that you need in order to get the transformation going. I would like to ask Stefano to any comments that you may have on the questions. Stefano.
Thank you, and I'll pick up on the Article 6 question and also on what Jonas already said. I mean, to me, in a way, Article 6 is the flip side of CBAM, if you think about it. I mean, CBAM is a tool to make up for a price differential between different regions. Article 6 can be a way to actually reduce that price differential and get to a more uniform carbon price. And that is because Article 6 really speaks to the international dimension of emission trading systems. As we all know, emission trading systems are mainly domestic in nature, but they do have potentially international components. One is linking of emission trading systems, and the other component is the use of international credits. And effectively what Article 6 does is that it puts in place a framework under the Paris Agreement that can account for ETS linkage, and that can also be a way for jurisdictions that want to do so to allow for the use of international credits in their domestic systems and account for that. So those are the main two international components of ETS, and that is where Article 6 intersect domestic emission trading systems. Article 6 can obviously also do much more than that, but those are the areas of interaction with domestic ETS.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And if I may add to what Stefano said, I think integrity is required in keeping up higher prices on carbon markets, and higher prices will see spontaneously a convergence. I think what we are seeing now is that in some constituency we have very, very low if not irrelevant prices, while in other constituencies we see reasonable prices. So integrity may increase the price level, and that may lead to a narrower span. I turn to Simone, because you did a lot of research on how to link several carbon markets. Simone?
Well, yes, and the more I know, the more difficult I find it, to be honest. But honestly, I would say that Article 6 is the right framework. On this, I fully agree with Stefano. I also have to say that linking is a long process. So I'm very much in favor of it, and I think it's a precious tool that we have at disposal. It's not the only one. We cannot rely on it because there are urgent problems to address, and I see that the diplomatic nature of linking requires time. By definition, in a way, because linking requires mutual trust. And trust is something that you build up over time. So there is a sort of tension between what we can do and what we can do fast. If I may take advantage of having the mic, I would like to add one word on the military expenditure, because I think that's a really important question. And in economic terms, I would say there is a clear trade-off between what we spend in military terms and what we can spend for climate. And this is actually a research line that with a colleague of mine we want to investigate in the future. And I would also like to stress one point that sometimes is ignored, that the war brings damages, environmental damages, that are not accounted for. We do not have an accounting of the emissions involved in the process of the war. And I am afraid this will emerge only in the future. So there are damages in environmental terms that are somehow like a black economy, like a black environmental economy that is not yet there. And finally, we will need to rebuild. And the future rebuilding of Ukraine, in this case, will also bring emissions. So let's try to consider this aspect, and let's hope that the war ends soon, even for this reason, apart from obvious humanitarian reasons.
Thank you very much, Simone. I was wondering whether there were more questions in the room. I have 1, 3, 4. I will have to limit there. I have the microphone, and I suggest that we start with the gentleman over there, and then we come back to you. You had already an opportunity, and first you, sir.
Thank you. My question is for Dora. I really very much agree with your perspectives around needing to catalyze private sector finance. And I think, also in agreement with Silvie, I think that a lot of the grant finance does need to go in terms of assistance in terms of structuring. But one of the things that very much concerns me, so I'm from South Africa, and I'm also a former state employee, so understand where it is that I'm coming from when I say this. But today we signed a deal with France and with Germany for a 20-year just transition finance deal for 300 million euros each. Which is at a lovely rate. It's at 3.3%, whereas if we had borrowed that ourselves, it would have been 8.9%. In theory, that's obviously helping us to transition, making the nice just transition situation. However, the reality is that the actual loan agreement is general budget support. Our country is notoriously and ridiculously corrupt. We steal everything that's not nailed down. So, like what ends up happening is that we pass this money over into the national fiscus as opposed to having a scenario where we have a credit enhancement mechanism that can be put in place that would really catalyze private sector investment. And that's really where it is that the private sector needs to be engaged. And if we could have something at an IMF level, for example, where we could start to have support for businesses at less of an extreme IRR, which we currently pay, that would be very much appreciated.
Thank you. I had a gentleman there and there and then we come back to, yeah.
Thank you. This is a question for Dora. I believe you mentioned about having like a global carbon floor price. I was wondering if you can offer your thoughts on what that price range could be, thinking that you mentioned that the price right now is not what we are expecting. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a question here. Here, yeah.
Thanks for the interesting panel. I'm Ian Mitchell from the Centre for Global Development. I also want to ask Dora a question. I'm very interested in these minimum carbon price floor and taxes on fossil fuels. I wondered if there are any examples of policy mechanisms where, as carbon prices and fossil fuel costs fall, taxes rise, automatically, and whether that's whether anyone's aware of those examples being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have the gentleman here on my right. And then I would like to ask the panelists to prepare for a brief reply and a concluding thought before we hand over to Johan for conclusions. Sir, you have.
So just firstly, on Global Gateway, it is funding education and health as well as climate. So those are the three focuses of it. And I mean, as a question related to that, I'm very surprised that as Europeans, no one seems to be aware of the details of this very large European project. Secondly, a question for Simone about ETS. I mean, your figures were very dramatic in terms of the rise of ETS revenues. However, if those ETS revenues are just being stolen, they really do not do any good, I mean, for the countries that they're going to. So is there any data about the effectiveness of the recipients and the use of the ETS revenues? Because you're now talking about huge amounts of money.
Thank you. So I start with the other way around. I start with Simone. Choose your question, Simone. You had a particular question and a concluding thought.
Okay, well, concerning the mechanism, whether there is a mechanism that may compensate a reduction in carbon prices with an increase in taxes, what I can say is that such mechanisms are, let's say, theoretically working, but not implemented enough so far. I would like to add that in the project that I was talking about, and this relates also to the discussion of carbon floor, we were suggesting to have a price corridor rather than a floor and a ceiling. And such a mechanism that you were describing would help keeping within the corridor. And the corridor, in my view, would help linking ETSs because it would give more certainty for the future, to the jurisdictions involved. But I can say more. And this is also somehow related to the right price range. I cannot tell an exact number, but I think that the corridor would help going towards the price range, which is in the end the social cost of carbon. That's the price we should aim at in the long run. To conclude, I disagree, if I may. I don't think that it's not huge, the amount of money we are talking about. I think it's a huge amount of money, talking about the ETS revenues. In terms of effectiveness, this is to be proved, I must admit. We have some proof of the effectiveness of the ETS, but your question was more specific. Did this money, were this money used in an effective way? Then this is another question, and I think this is food for thought for the future.
Thank you, Simone. Stefano?
Yeah, I'll be really, really brief, and I just wanted to respond, broadly speaking, to the points that the other two gentlemen raised. I think, one really crucial aspect of ETS and what really, like in most cases, like determines like the successfulness of an ETS is the governance of it, and it tends to be often overlooked as an aspect. I mean, when we talk about emission trading systems, we focus on sectors covered, cap, prices, and all of that. But the governance of a system is what really determines the success of of the instrument, and I mean, Joss will also be able to testify from his experience in the European Commission, but getting the governance right is essential. It can prevent fraud, it can prevent misbehavior, it can prevent wrongdoing, as you were describing, and like any other aspect related to emission trading systems, there's no single recipe for how a government has to design the governance of it. It has to be tailored to what the system looks like. It has to be tailored to the political set out of every country. And as Simone was pointing out, emission trading systems to a large extent are a test as you go kind of exercise. Things are being tested, things are being proved, and then as we go by, we also learn what works and what doesn't. And governance, the same principles applies. And in that respect, it's quite important to look at the lessons learned and the experiences made in Europe and in other countries that went through that process already.
Thank you, Stefano. May I ask Silvie whether you would like to come in? Yeah.
I can come in and take the question on South Africa. So my understanding is, yes, it is to a certain level general budget support, but in my understanding is that it's linked to policy reform. So that's what we call policy-based lending. So the availability of funding and the availability of next tranches is linked to concrete progress milestones in terms of policy implementation and progress in the transformation. But yes, to a certain extent, we feel that general budget support is really what we also need to provide more flexibility and to finance also this capacity and institutional capacity building we need. Maybe I can add 2 sentences as a conclusion. I think we all agree that climate pathways need to be development pathways for our partner countries. I think that's clear. Policy packages are most efficient. This is also what's pretty proven, and this also applies to the finance part. We are under immense time pressure, and we need to address a really broad range of barriers. So need to facilitate and catalyze progress at very different levels and maximize synergies. And this includes carbon pricing, but this should not limit interventions to carbon pricing. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvie. Dora?
Thank you. So on the South Africa question and the Just Economic Transition Program, so we are not closely included or involved in that, so I cannot comment on the specific program. But I agree that the quality of institution and the strength of institutions is a really important aspect of development. And so we at the IMF, we assign a really high importance to this. So in our own capacity development and program conditionality, this is something that we think is really important, and we always put a really high weight on this. So we provide assistance to countries to help them improve their institutions, doing structural reforms to improve the business climate and those kind of things. But this is not specific to South Africa. I think this is a general concern for many countries, that the institutions or the quality of spending is not necessarily as efficient as they could be. On the international carbon price floor, so we recommend an international carbon price floor that would start with an agreement or collaboration of a small number of countries. I don't think we should be the ones telling the exact level of carbon price. I think it's up to the parties to agree and negotiate on the carbon price that would be applied to different levels of development of countries. We have some illustrative scenarios where we say, well, if we assume $75 per ton for the most advanced economies, maybe the emerging markets should have something like $50 per ton, and the lowest income countries something like 25. But this is really just an illustrative scenario. So this is not a recommendation. I think it's really important that the parties internalize the whole process and they agree on what they think is desirable. I think that leads nicely to the third question. So I don't think the level of carbon pricing should be linked to energy prices. In fact, I think it's really important, as I mentioned, that we have a credible and predictable path for the carbon price increase. It would be important to start at some level as soon as possible, let's say introducing something close to a $10 global average already this year, and have a credible path for every single individual country on how they're going to raise the carbon price over the next 8 to 10 years, what is going to be the exact increase. So we have a predictable, credible path that the investors and private sector can take into account. But we do have examples from the tax literature on different types of taxes that are linked to some price movements. As I said, I don't think that's the way forward on carbon pricing, but if you think about natural resources, for example, like resource rent taxes are typically ones that would vary depending on the level of profits or level of prices, or if you think about well-designed windfall taxes, those can also be good examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. And I take only two observations away from this discussion before I hand over to Johan. Governance matters, and it pays off to have grant money contributed to it. To the carbon price, what we saw in Europe is as soon as the ambition level is raised, the carbon price is being raised. So if the NDCs become more ambitious, then we will see also price levels going up. I think that's a very important element that was brought forward by Dora. Johan, you have the concluding thoughts.
Yeah, thanks Jos, and thanks everyone for this incredibly, not only rich, but also in my mind, very strategic and very relevant discussion that has so many connections to what's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh during the negotiations here. And let me just give you a few reflections of some sensitive key policy issues. One is that we have been discussing today the financing of all forms of carbon, which is oil, coal, and natural gas. But we have a clear discussion also on the voluntary carbon markets, which is about the carbon pricing and the value of carbon in investing in nature as a carbon sink for helping us to handle the fact that we're lagging behind on the mitigation pathways. This has to be handled with care in the discussions, because we scientifically know very well that we cannot allow a slowdown on reduction or reducing emissions from coal, oil, and natural gas, and offset this with carbon markets, which gives carbon credits on nature climate solutions. We need both. We need additionality, and this is fundamental in the finance space. The second is that I think we've had a lot of proof in this discussion that nothing less than a deep financial reform and scaling of carbon pricing is absolutely necessary, but it will not be delivering the Paris Agreement on its own. And it's quite interesting that I think there's more and more evidence emerging that a portfolio of climate policies will be required, combining a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, a budget and mitigation pathways, end dates on fossil fuel use and internal combustion engines to put really red lines in the sand at different scales, and then use a price on carbon as a way of avoiding rebound effects that we shove the impacts of the remaining fossil fuel consumption and production over to other parts of the markets in the world. This is why I think we should never allow the whole endeavor of letting a price on carbon gradually scale up to the global level, as has been pointed out, particularly by Simone, but others here as well, to be our target. And I would finally say that, of course, we have problems with corruption, but we should never allow, in my mind, corruption and difficulties of governance to hinder us from having very ambitious aims on carbon pricing. So with that, it's been incredibly rich to do this together, Jos, and institutionally we've had this as a EUI and a PIC hosted event, and thanks for attending this. We were joking before that we're competing with President Biden's talk here, so you chose the right session. This was where the real content was. Joking, of course, there was some important messages over there as well, I'm sure. But thank you for that. And Jos, if you have any final words.
Well, thank you very much. I can just echo the good cooperation that we are commonly doing in our institutions, and that was brought forward through the panelists. So many thanks to the panelists from different perspectives. I learned a lot in this discussion, and I hope you did so as well. Thank you very much and good night.